Peter Trachtenberg is up next. Peter Trachtenberg is, well, first of all, thank you for coming, Peter. Thank you for featuring tonight. Peter Trachtenberg holds a BA from Sarah Lawrence College and an MA from the City College of New York. He's the author of Another Sane Devotion. Another Insane Devotion. On the Love of Cats and Persons. 7 Tattoos, a memoir in the flesh. A memoir in the flesh. This is going well. And the Book of Calamities. People, Peter Trachtenberg.
Thank you. Do you all hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. It's really a great honor to be reading at Speakeasy. And I'm so happy we're in this awesome space. This is like so much hipper than 501. And I am the defector tonight because I'm actually reading fiction. This is from a novel called Ruination. And it is mostly about the bankruptcy of the Ulysses S. Grant in 1884 and 1885. But there's a second narrative, which is that of a guy named Alfred Foster. This is an illegitimate son of Stephen Foster who's come to New York around the same time, partly to be a songwriter. He plays piano. He has been playing piano in a dance cellar, which was basically a house of prostitution with music. And he has just lost 2 of his fingers, so that career option is gone. And my only other preface is that I do not like historical fiction. And this parts of the book are my attempt to deal with the fact that I'm writing what is historical fiction in a genre that I don't like and I'm deeply suspicious of. One day he ran into Enzo the fiddler, who told him he ought to try playing the grind organ. It was much easier than a piano. A monkey could play it, and one could carry it. And if Alfred rented one, they could play music together in the street and keep whatever they made aside from a small cut to the livery. The latter was run out of a stall on Forsyth Street. The staff and customers were all Italians. Enzo seemed to know a lot of them, or else the fact that they had come here from the same country, speaking more or less the same language and working in the same low and dangerous trades, made them apprehensible to each other, as they hadn't been in their homelands. Before they began to think of themselves as Americans, the newcomers realized for the first time that they were Irishmen, or Slovaks, or Italians. The organ was an ornately inlaid wooden box cut away in front for a row of graduated pipes and operated by a hand crank on one side. Its music already resided inside it, inscribed on its metal barrel. The livery owner cranked out a song for Alfred, but it was hard to make out over the crash of the nearby elevator. Nor did he understand a word of the negotiations, which Enzo and the other man conducted with shrugs, grimaces, shakings of fists, and dismissive flicks of the fingers. He knew they were finished only when he was told to hand over 20 cents for the deposit and bow his head so the instrument straps could be slipped over his shoulders. The weight of it bent him almost double, but Enzo showed him that it had a folding stand that would support it while he played. Still, he had to carry it as they walked about the streets, leaning backward until the small of his back was rigid with pain that the laudanum barely assuaged. The drug might have been expressly compounded to be almost equal to whatever pain you suffered. Almost, but not quite. This was why you always needed more. On their first day as partners, Alfred and Enzo went uptown to Broadway and 23rd Street, which was called Ladies' Mile because of its fashionable shops. Ladies liked music, and Enzo reasoned that they would be moved by the sight of one as young and delicate as Alfred playing with a mutilated hand, though it would be even better if he were blind. It was as he supposed it would be. The thoroughfares were wide and clean, and the crowds of well-dressed women had a sweet scent, and many of them stopped to listen and drop a coin in Enzo's hat. But after a few hours, a policeman came and said they were loitering and would have taken their instruments if Enzo hadn't given them half their money. Other street players warned them the same could be expected in every neighborhood where rich folk went. So they ended up playing in the poor ones by the push carts on Essex Street in Mulberry Bend, on Mott Street outside St. Patrick's Church after morning mass, and at the stairs of the 2nd and 3rd Avenue elevated, especially on Saturdays when the men coming down were generous because they had just been paid and the week's work was done. Alfred's instrument knew 7 songs: the Battle Hymn of the Republic, Marching Through Georgia, When Johnny Comes Marching Home, and Nearer, My God, to Thee, and also, as if contrived by Providence, 3 songs of his father's: Camptown Races, Old Black Joe, and Hard Times Come Again No More. He couldn't choose which ones to play. Their sequence was unvarying, and if a passerby asked for Camptown Races, he'd have to crank through the tunes preceding it and hope Enzo's fiddle playing was lively enough to hold the fellow's attention. The grind organ wasn't so much an instrument as a machine, and the one who played it was less a musician than the machine's operator. All he had to do was turn the crank at a steady speed and sing. Alfred had never sung while he was playing at the cellar. No one would have heard him. And even if it were possible to sing while playing the violin, Enzo's accent would have spoiled the pleasure people got from hearing songs they remembered from their youth. There were some who would fly into a rage if they heard a patriotic song sung with a foreign accent. Between them, they managed to make about 50 cents a day. It was enough for the fiddle player to support his wife and 2 children, but Alfred needed more for the rental fee in laudanum. Often he ended up playing until dusk and returned the organ to the livery barely before the corrugated metal gate was lowered shut. On Baxter Street in those days, the colony of black freedmen that had lived there since the War of Independence had given way before an incursion of Jews, many of them employed in the fencing of stolen goods. They were known for their filth, as the freemen were known for their cleanliness, and their impiety, as their co-religionists further east were celebrated for observing a bewildering number of sacred rules and for kissing their holy book. One of these fences was the elephantine. She weighed more than 250 pounds, Marm Mandelbaum, the queen of thieves. She ran her operation from a notion store, above which she kept an apartment stocked with jewelry, plate, and silverware plundered from uptown mansions. She was known to boast, "I am Ma because I give them what a mother cannot sometimes give: money and horses and diamonds." Further uptown on 2nd Avenue, not far from one of the Jewish theaters, a tenement building exploded one afternoon as if struck by a howitzer shell, then went up in flames. 7 tenants were killed. A few hours later, the death toll would have been 10 times that. On investigation, it was found that the landlady, a foreigner, had gone months without paying for gas, and the company had cut off service. At her instruction, the superintendent had tried tapping gas from an adjoining building. He had done this incorrectly. Since the explosion was judged to be a tragic accident and not an act of malice, no criminal charges were filed, and years later the landlady's attorneys were still appealing the civil penalties, while the building site, being caught up in litigation, remained a crater half filled with dust and broken brick and the smashed relics of the persons who had once lived there. In the Italian slums where Enzo lived, criminal gangs had sprung up among the law-abiding populace, which by and large was so docile and hard-working that landlords preferred the Italians to the troublemaking Irish and fanatical Germans. Not so the black-handers. They charged ruinous protection fees to the neighborhood's small businesses. The owners who were late paying had their establishments wrecked before their eyes, the plates smashed, the bar and tables hacked apart with axes, the clothes slashed with razors. The ones who refused to pay were murdered, and the ones foolish enough to call the police saw their families murdered before them. The Irish and American gangs fought pitched battles with clubs and shivs. The Italians favored ambushes with firearms, like the gang lord who invited his rivals to a parley where his assassins burst through the doors and shot them en masse, using the rapid-firing guns. They were large and clumsy, requiring 2 people to carry them, that had first been tested in the Great Conflict and perfected against the Indian tribes. Another member of this fraternity was gunned down in a restaurant before the other diners. None of them could identify the killers. It had the unforeseen effect of making the place popular with outsiders. who lined up for hours to dine on lank noodles and tomato sauce at the scene of an infamous murder. The careers of these men were brief, ending in prison or the grave, but one boss evaded justice for 50 years by walking the streets in his nightclothes, speaking nonsense when questioned by the police, and generally pretending to be mad, for the mad were beyond the scope of justice, and the dissolute society playboy who slew a rival for his wife's affections on the roof of Madison Square Garden got away with his crime by persuading a jury he had been suffering from a temporary brainstorm. Far to the north, in Central Park, a young lady of good family was assaulted one night in a manner so atrocious the papers could barely hint at it. Blame fell on a crew of young Negro and Spanish boys from the neighborhood. Such attacks were said to be required as initiations, as gangs in other parts of town made novices prove their mettle by punching random strangers on the street or even shooting policemen. Under questioning, the 5 youths confessed to the crime, were put on trial, and in spite of a lack of physical evidence and protests that their confessions had been beaten out of them, were found guilty and sent to prison. 20 years previously, they would have been handed over to the justice of an outraged citizenry. In an unexpected show of civic-mindedness, a prominent businessman of the city, known for his fleshy good looks and high living, took out an advertisement in the papers calling for the miscreants to be put to death without delay. This being New York City and not the prairie, even the most salutary executions took time, and the young men were still alive 13 years later when another man confessed to the crime and they were released. The tycoon who had called for their execution was silent, though when the city finally paid them a settlement for their false imprisonment, he denounced it as a waste of taxpayers' money. Crime wasn't solely the province of the poor. In a fashionable downtown neighborhood, a little child was taken to the hospital after being savagely beaten by her adoptive father. A few days later, she died. The father was a lawyer of the Hebrew race. He had adopted the girl illegally after the natural mother had paid him to find her suitable parents, pocketing the fee and keeping the child for himself. He had a common-law wife whom he brutalized. During the trial, it emerged that she had failed to stop the beating and let the child languish in her own blood for 10 hours before finally seeking help. Her advocates claimed that her mistreatment had deadened her moral faculties. Rendering the brute even more despicable was his lack of remorse. Years after he was sent to prison, not for murder but criminal manslaughter, he was still arguing that the child had endured at most 8 hours of pain and suffering. The ballad sellers wrote songs about him, the fiend of 10th Street. And all over the city, people were dying of tainted alcohol and laudanum and morphine. The latter substances were said to be particularly pernicious. Chemists blamed it on some property of the drugs, and physicians on some weakness of the user's constitution, and ministers on sin in modern education. The mayor of a town in the Midwest blamed it on nefarious foreigners conspiring to weaken the moral fiber of the nation. There were old soldiers who had been given the drug when they were wounded in the war 20 years before and had never since known a day without it, and fast youths who had come to an opium den in Chinatown, meaning only to gawk, and discovered a languid, murmuring bliss in which each moment swelled as if from an eyedropper and took a lifetime to fall. People used because they could still feel the surgeon's saw rasping through a shattered thigh bone in a field hospital near Jackson. They used because the farm had been sold. They used because they had been hurt on the job and swept out like the day's sawdust. They used because they had worked at whaling or weaving or any of a dozen other trades that had fallen from practice and could not find a place in any other. They used because a man had taken advantage of them and left them in an embarrassed condition. They used because a man had used them roughly, because many men had. They used because they lived in a nation that had been founded on the pursuit of happiness but made no provision for its attainment. They used because they were poor in a country that promised that anyone could be rich, and in which many people seemed to be becoming so overnight. So what did that make them? What kind of failure? There were neighborhoods in the city, and not the ones you'd expect, where you couldn't walk a half mile without coming upon the body of some failure collapsed on a park bench or a seat of the elevated, or in the street itself like a sack of garbage. You had to shake them to know if they were dead. Thank you.